Hi, everyone. We're here to talk about one of the 12 grand challenges in public administration. This one is Steward Natural Resources and Address Climate Change. My name is Joe Mitchell. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives and International Programs at the National Academy of Public Administration. And we're going to have a conversation with Bob Perciasepe, who is the chair of our working group, our Election 2020 working group on this topic, and also with Barry Rave, who is one of the members of this working group. So Bob, I want to just ask you, what's your connection to this grand challenge? Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved with this.
Well, I'm a fellow, which is a great honor. But during my career, I had the honor of being the Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency for almost 6 years during the Obama administration, and worked a lot on climate change. In my current job, I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which is obviously by its title focused on climate change. But in the past, I've worked on natural resources issues as well as climate change. So it's exciting for me to be able to be helping the Academy on this project.
Our first recommendation concerned the optimization and expansion of federal R&D related to issues of natural resource protection and climate change. And we were very mindful that there is already a rich set of research units, laboratories all across the country that do this work, that really create a great foundation already for the federal government, and in many cases have played a substantial role in progress that has already been made, including some very significant gains in the deployment of wind and solar technologies. We were, though, aware that there might be possible ways for future administrations to take some additional steps. In one case is where technology is moving forward very rapidly, and yet for the most part has not been employed either by the federal government, to our knowledge, or states that might be playing significant regulatory roles. One example here involves methane, or CH4. Which is released from a number of sources, but most notably in the United States, the production and distribution of oil and natural gas, with a particularly acute concern being releases of flaring or venting methane directly into the atmosphere. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas with far greater impact on the climate in its first century in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. It also contributes to the formation of air toxics, most notably volatile organic compounds, and it's also a valuable natural resource. Methane is the constituent element of natural gas. It has energy value, it's market value, and to release or to waste that methane into the atmosphere is true natural resource waste, exacerbating environmental issues while failing to capture proper benefit or rent from that natural resource. We have begun to see in the US and internationally develop of new technologies through satellites, through drones, other kinds of monitoring systems, where in long supply chains and long decentralized linkage points connecting shale producing gas wells, there could be tremendous opportunity for a major step forward, taking these technologies and actually applying them at the pump and along these supply chains. And so we see that as a really significant opportunity. We also saw in this area great opportunities for greater linkage between federal laboratories that do R&D in this area and land-grant colleges and universities and other state-based research operations. There are a large number of states in almost every region of the country that have begun to invest in renewable energy or energy transition R&D. And so our group saw some real opportunities here to better partner and link these connections in our federal system, but a federal system of related research. A final area that we explored in this area of optimizing and expanding federal R&D is in the issue of orphan or abandoned wells. We do not have a good inventory of the number of wells from oil and gas that have been abandoned. One state estimate suggests about 500,000 to 550,000. A US Environmental Protection Agency study estimates over 3 million. These are dangerous. There's a public health and a public safety risk. They also tend abandoned wells, in some cases going back for decades or even centuries. They may release other kinds of contaminants, including methane. Again, this valued natural resource, just releasing those into the atmosphere in ways that we don't know. So we also saw this as an area where a careful systematic inventory could be taken, possibly harnessing that technology, and then beginning to think about a strategy that has broad acceptance, the idea of trying to cap or restrict these wells from releasing substances and causing risks to people who might be in the vicinity of them. So all of these together, but also other issues as well, were part of our discussion of the optimization and expansion of federal R&D in this area. That's one recommendation. An additional recommendation involved the coordination and expansion of renewable energy siting. Renewables have grown. There's been a remarkable transition in the United States away from coal and toward more reliance on a combination of natural gas and a mixture of renewables. Most notably thus far, wind and solar, but also increasingly beginning to include other renewable technologies. And signs in certainly many states and regions of the country, really throughout the United States, that renewables are likely to be on the upswing in coming years and decades. Here, several ideas began to emerge. One was to use techniques of spatial planning to begin to identify suitable sites. In some cases, reclamation areas, possibly some of those abandoned well sites, possibly hazardous waste or solid waste cleanup areas, possibly even Superfund sites. Can we really begin to develop an inventory through spatial planning and other type of techniques to inventory and know all the places in the United States where you might have a convergence between strong renewable potential, perhaps because of the intensity of wind or the frequency with which solar arrives or geothermal potential, and link that to areas that may have been restored to some level of safety after environmental harm was done, but may not be safe or attractive for housing developments or creating a school or something along those lines. Could there be a marriage between these kinds of sites, which tend to exist in every state, every region of the country, and use technology to begin to better understand and inventory what those sites mean, not only for siting of facilities, but storage and transmission capacity, which we know we are going to need in any event. We also saw real opportunities here for greater intergovernmental coordination, federal to state, but also local governments, which often play such a large role in land use siting decisions, and of course, tribal governments, which in the natural resources area happen to have substantial powers, a substantial authority, and historically there has been major coordination issues between federal, tribal, state, and local. And so this is not a new concern, but as we begin to possible expansions of renewable energy in ways that are almost hard to envision now, or certainly were hard to envision 10 years ago, that intergovernmental coordination piece looms large. The report also discusses issues of offsets, ways you can offset or trade emission reductions in one area for another. And there you'll see a lot of discussion of the whole question of biodiversity, natural areas, growth, habitat areas that might be woven into a larger conversation about how we think about offsets and markets that might develop in terms of carbon credits and carbon trading systems, with many, many possibilities and opportunities. Finally, we are mindful that while we have been involved in the US heavily in offshore oil and gas production, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, and I had the privilege of serving on a 2017 NAPA study on offshore oil production involving stewardship of the Interior Department. We're also mindful that the charge for the Interior Department is to produce energy offshore from multiple sources, not just liquid fossil fuels or gases. That opens up questions like wind turbine siting. And given the enormous advances, certainly in the European Union, but now a great many coastal states, the question arising whether or not there could be an expanding role for the Interior Department in working cooperatively in states that are eager to explore offshore wind farms or individual turbines or transmission lines in that entire practice. That's a different kind of intergovernmental coordination, but it's an interesting one and an important one. There have clearly been many policy changes in this area. An executive order issued by President Trump actually earlier this year actually restricts offshore oil and gas drilling for states like Florida, as well as others, including the Carolinas. But offshore wind continues to move forward, including backed by state policies, particularly in the northern Atlantic states, some of the central coast states. And this is one where the traditional functions to focus on petroleum, oil and gas, understandably with traditional drilling legacies, may be expanding, is actually required under existing provisions for those units to pursue multiple sources of energy. And this is an area then to begin to think about transitioning workforce, transitioning preparedness, permitting, inspections, all the things that are necessary to have a world-class regime to oversee offshore energy development, regardless of the source. So those are simply 2 of the 5 actually broader recommendations that our team produced in this report.
So the 2 questions then were, the first one was, there are a lot of federal departments and agencies involved in natural resources and the environment. So what does that landscape look like? What are the major departments, agencies, programs that are involved in this area that we can use?
The interesting things about the natural resources and climate change in general is that virtually every agency has some particular potential role.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it, that's because they're so cross-cutting, these challenges. And, you can go from national security, where we're looking at our facilities around the world, our installations around the world, and are they resilient to climate change, to potential hotspots around the world because of tensions due to resource issues, and also, the broader international coordination that the security community and the State Department have to be involved with. Those, you go all the way from that all the way to how does USDA manage their conservation programs in a way that might sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere as they work with farmers and ranchers and working lands. So it runs the spectrum, but you can probably identify some of the agencies that have the most important roles, and that would be like the Energy Department, obviously, Agriculture I just mentioned, EPA, the Interior Department with the management of land, and also the Bureau of Land Management in there, as well as the U.S. Geologic Survey. Then you have the Commerce Department, which has NOAA in it, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, operative word atmospheric, has a lot of science behind a lot of this, as does NASA and the work they do. But you can't dismiss some of the other agencies like HUD and the work they do with cities to potentially help them be more resilient to climate change, or the Labor Department as we transition the energy systems in the country. So it really is a pretty widespread responsibility, with some agencies having obviously a little bit more than others. I want to say one more thing about the organization and who is involved with this at the federal level. All these different agencies get coordinated. They get coordinated by the Office of the President. And so you have entities in the Office of the President, like the Council on Environmental Quality, or the National Economic Council, or the National Security Council, or the Domestic Policy Council, or many others, including OMB, for instance, or the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And those agents, those coordinating entities inside the Executive Office of the President are managed by the President's Chief of Staff. So if you really wanted to have a better coordination or more focused coordination around the federal government, which is going to be needed given all those different roles I just mentioned, having the President's Chief of Staff involved, perhaps with a Deputy Chief of Staff for Climate Change and Natural Resources, would be a very in the line of command approach to really heighten the way the agencies coordinate with each other.
Well, that sounds like a really important thing to do, especially given all the agencies that you documented are involved with climate change. We were asked as part of the grand challenges, we had our working groups look at specifically what could be done with a realistic agenda for 2021. So for an administration, whether re-elected or newly elected. So what are some practical things that the administration in 2021 could do to help address this grand challenge?
So this grand challenge that the National Academy has come up with and has put forward last year is, as it says, a grand challenge. And it requires, in order to achieve the goals that the Academy set out, major changes in legislation and regulations and operations of the federal government, state governments, businesses has to occur. Our work group did not look at what all of that needs to be, but it's suffice it to say it needs to happen sometime in the not too distant future. But immediately out of the gates to a new administration, or even that can be added on to the continuation of an existing administration, there are things that can be done in the existing world to build on some of the stuff that's already going on. Mostly these are going to be at the agency level or at the interagency level. But let me just name a few that we mentioned in our work group report, and we have many others in there. But these are some that probably are pretty straightforward and recognizable right off the bat. One is procurement. The agencies, the federal government buys a lot of stuff. Some estimates, so almost 50% of the cement made in the United States is somehow involved with a federal project, whether it's a highway or some kind of building. There's cement that has less carbon in it and cement that has more carbon in it. So if the federal government procurement policies were adjusted to be a little bit more sensitive to that, you could start to make a big difference. The grants that the federal agencies give. You take an agency like EPA and you say, well, look at its budget is somewhere between $7 and $8 billion. Well, more than half of that goes to grants to states or grants to local governments to do infrastructure improvements, and tribes as well. How those grants are operated, what kind of conditions are on those grants, what the expectations are. Even in the agriculture department, I mentioned earlier, the conservation program, those funds that flow to the landowners to help improve conservation practices really can make a difference. And they already are, but they could even be tweaked more to improve the way carbon is sequestered out of the atmosphere. Cooperation, there's really not much cost to cooperation. Creating an ability for agencies to work together on, to coordinate these grants, for instance. Management of resources that are under the stewardship of the federal government. Things like national parks, or public lands under the jurisdiction of the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, or even the Army Corps of Engineers. All these agencies have millions and millions of acres under their stewardship, and the stewardship of those lands can be modified to reduce the amount of potential emissions that could come from them, but also enhance their ability to absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. Another very low cost thing that we point out in a number of areas is to simply do better planning. Plan for the impacts of climate change. Include that in some of the work that you do. Federal facilities all over the world and all over the United States need to become more resilient to the coming effects and the already here effects of climate change, and agencies can ramp that up. And lastly, I'll mention the federal government spends probably not enough money, but certainly a lot of money on research and applied research, whether it's the Department of Energy and the amazing national labs we have there, NASA and space platforms that they have to monitor the Earth, NOAA and their field research, the US Geologic Survey and their field research. All of these agencies, including EPA, who synthesizes a lot of research for their needs, that work can be really tailored and coordinated to improve our ability to understand solutions going forward, for whether it's immediately or sometime in the not too distant future. So there's a lot that can be done with a lot of the existing programs, and that should happen as soon as possible.
Well, well, it sounds like your working group has really come up with a lot of very, very good, very practical, very implementable recommendations. I think that is great, and clearly, this grand challenge is very important to the current and future of our country. I mean, you look at all the disasters we've had, the wildfires, the hurricanes, rising sea levels, temperatures, even the coronavirus. I mean, these are related to climate change and to changing ecosystems. So I think that your working group has come up with some really good recommendations for beginning to address these issues. So just thanks so much for all of your work. And then I would just close with our grand challenge is kind of what we're planning on doing next year. So our focus this year has been kind of coming up with these practical recommendations for 2021. So next year, our fellows will be working to promote these recommendations and hopefully get them implemented and track progress. And we're also going to start working on a longer term strategic agenda for each grand challenge. We know that this is a 10+ year effort. And so we wanted to kind of say, what is the strategy? What is the vision? What is attainable by the end of this decade to start addressing these? So those are some of the things we'll be working on next year. So thanks, Bob, to you and your working group. Do you have any other concluding thoughts for us?
No, I'm just happy that the Academy has dove into these issues. It's not just this one that we worked on, our work group, but many of the others. And these grand challenges are very helpful, I think, to our mission of providing this guidance and advice to society and to the government. So I'm looking forward to working on it some more.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to having you. And the Academy's mission is to make government work and work for all, and to address our biggest challenges. So thanks to you and all of your working group members, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.